Hello and welcome to Tank and AFE News. My name's Tom and today we are doing a book review. I'm sure you're shocked. Like 90% of my videos are book reviews these days. Anyhow, today we are looking at, and this is courtesy of Pen and Sword publishers, Forgotten Tanks and Guns of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. This is by David Lister, edited by Paul Charlton. And this book came out, I think at the beginning of the year, so it's only been out for a couple months, 2 or 3 months. And it is pretty self-explanatory as to what it's about. These are forgotten weapons, primarily tanks, some guns, of sort of the interwar years. So these are all things that never really were issued. These are forgotten prototypes, things that were in development but never made it to being actual service weapons. For mostly obvious reasons. As you look in the book, a lot of this stuff's pretty weird, pretty obscure. Now, Mr. Lister, as I understand it, is sort of a professional researcher of sorts who's worked for a number of different, some of the different tank-related video games like War Thunder and World of Tanks. And he also is one of the people that's written for Tanks Encyclopedia, the website, and wrote this. He writes articles as well. I think some of them have been published sort of in the Tank Museum's periodical. So somebody who's spent some time combing through the archives at different places and has dug up some of this weird stuff, which is what made it into this book. So primarily the focus is on British stuff, since that's probably what he spent the most time researching, I would guess. But he does have some other things in there. So for example, the first chapter's on Japanese heavy tanks, and it gets into one I've not really been aware of, and I admit I don't have a ton of materials on Japanese tanks. There's just not a ton that's been published in English. But he talks a little bit about some of these sort of Japanese heavy tanks that are said to have existed. It's a little unclear. The evidence for some of the existence of some of these things is a little sketchy. But interesting stuff nonetheless, and fun to look through. And honestly, at this point, anything I can add to my collection, that stuff I haven't heard of before, because I've got a fairly extensive library. There's not, to find out about tanks I wasn't familiar with, it doesn't happen very often. So it's kind of fun with a book like this. He gets into then some of the sort of airborne tank projects of the period. So you can see here he's getting, hopefully you can see that. This camera should be able to pick that up. Different British airborne ideas. Amphibious tanks, some of them are pretty crazy. I mean, take a look at that thing. It's like this monstrosity of, I don't know, not practical, certainly. So like I said, a lot of things in here that were ideas that were thrown out, back in that period, and never made it very far because they're obviously impractical. Then he gets into some of the sort of tractor tanks. I mean, the most famous of which is the Bob Semple, which he doesn't really talk about this one, but he sort of, that's one of the most famous. But there are other attempts at converting agricultural tractors into armored fighting vehicles, and that's actually, what's on the cover of the book here, this guy right here. So that's the Garrett, which was an attempt at making a tractor tank, and actually probably a slightly better one than the Bob Semple. Although being better than that particular vehicle is not difficult to do. Section on British smoke cannons of sorts. Let's see what else we got in here. Some different anti-tank weapons, oddball anti-tank weapons that were developed primarily by the British in these years. There's a thing on the Schwimmpanzer 36, which was a little amphibious, 8-wheeled amphibious vehicle that the Germans were sort of fairly obscure one. And then a bunch of stuff about different British tank projects. There was some attempts to make some remote control tanks in that period. And he does go on just with a history of some of the British cruiser tank development, some of the more obscure facets of that in the period. And then also some stuff, Martel, who developed some of the tankettes in that period. And if you watch my video on the Polish tankettes of 1939, I get a little bit in the history of Martel. But Martel, he created a bunch of weird stuff, including these things that are sort of like these little tiny tracked armored coffins, for better lack of a better description. They were supposed to be these sort of one-man armored transports of sorts that, when you see the pictures of them, it's you can see why it didn't get too far, the idea. These They literally look like a coffin on flimsy tracks. So anyhow, a lot of interesting stuff in here. Here we go. Here's a picture of some of Martell's. Let's see if you can see that. We're getting a shadow from the shotgun mic there, but yeah, you should be able to see that. So all sorts of crazy ideas in here. Like I said, it's a fun book. It's not a terribly big book. It's only 120 pages or so, and it's a hardcover. So you know, the content per price ratio is not spectacular, but the content's probably stuff you haven't seen before, or if you have, maybe not in book form, because I think some of these things he's probably featured on some of his web articles and whatnot. But certainly a book that is not like any other book I have in my collection. So, like I said, at this point, you know, anything like this that's a little out of the ordinary, it's a welcome addition, because that's sort of where I am in my own personal collection, is kind of filling in the corners, so to speak. So, anyhow, this one, as far as the information, it is, retail price is $34.95. That's, I'm sure you can find it for less on Amazon, or other booksellers. And, yeah, it was released in December of 2018, so it's only been out for 4 months. And, from Pen and Sword. And again, I thank them for this copy. I saw this one, I just asked them, like, hey, can I have a review copy? And they obliged, and I really appreciate that kind of stuff, because honestly, you know, it's part of the reason I do this channel. I like books. I like being able to review them, and you know, them being able to give me review copies makes it possible, and hopefully it helps the authors, and some people watching this will buy the book. All right, so thank you much, and we will catch you on the next one.